Hey YouTube, welcome to my first video. You can call me Blue, and I'm a police officer in Miami with over 10 years of experience. On this channel, we'll be going through all things crime related, from serial killers, other crimes of passion, as well as any crimes committed by the police, all while being given a fresh perspective from someone with actual law enforcement experience. Stick around if you like the content. Today, we'll be talking about Jeffery Dahmer. Many of you have probably seen the fairly recent Netflix documentary about him and his crimes. One of the most frustrating things that I'm sure many of you saw was such a lackluster response to numerous complaints by the police. So today, we'll be outlining Dahmer's spree and identifying every time Dahmer could have or should have been caught, so we can answer this series' ultimate question: how did he get away with it for so long? At this point, I think many of us know who Dahmer is, as well as his background, so I'll keep it brief. Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he was raised with his brother David and by parents Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. Dahmer did display some troubling signs as a youth, such as a fascination with death and anatomy. But what I want to focus on today is every time Dahmer had a meaningful interaction with law enforcement that could have resulted in an early stop to his murders and the saving of many lives. So that brings us to June of 1978, the scene of Dahmer's first murder. Let's take a second and set the stage. Those of you who have seen the documentary know more or less of his life at this time, but I would like to summarize for those of you who don't know. Jeffery Dahmer is 18 years old, living alone at his parents' home. This is due to a recent split by his mother and father, and both parents vacating the residence, leaving Dahmer alone. During this time, Dahmer admits to having fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker, bringing them home, and completely dominating them. On this fateful day, Dahmer would encounter his first victim hitchhiking, 18-year-old Stephen Hicks. Dahmer would bring Hicks back to his apartment, where conflicting accounts would state that they either had consensual sex or Dahmer became aware that Hicks was straight and would not have sex with him. In either event, Dahmer would eventually strike Hicks in the back of the head with a dumbbell and strangle him. This will lead us to our first encounter with police and Dahmer's first chance at being caught and stopped. It is important to keep in mind that in every murder, we cannot speak to the victims and only have Dahmer's version of the events to rely on. As we go forward, please keep this in mind and take everything we're told from Dahmer with a huge grain of salt. Dahmer tells us after murdering Hicks, he began to dismember his body and bury it on the property, but after several hours grew uncomfortable with the idea and dug the remains back up. At this time, Dahmer used chemicals to strip the flesh from the bones and transported the broken bits of remaining bones and perhaps some larger unstripped remains in bags to a nearby wooded area. While driving, an officer stopped Dahmer and during the course of the traffic stop conducted a DUI investigation. Here's where I would like to offer some clarification on what likely happened here based on my own training and experiences. So for some background, most of the time when a traffic stop is conducted, it's for a routine reason. That could range from not using a blinker, having an equipment violation such as a headlight or brake light out, or a moving violation such as speeding. Most cops gain complacency when dealing with routine aspects of their job, just like everyone else in every job, as humans have a tendency to do. So when you're on a traffic stop, you're trained to detect signs of impairment from a driver. These can come in the way of slurred speech, smelling like alcohol, stumbling, or apparent bloodshot watery eyes. None of these alone prove that you're drunk, and most of them can originate from a medical condition. For instance, a diabetic going into diabetic shock can have a sweet smell coming from their breath, which can be mistaken for alcohol. So an important next step is to have them conduct tests that are proven to be mostly reliable to help determine if they are in fact impaired. Just because someone is showing signs of being drunk, or even admits to having a drink or two, does not mean that they are intoxicated to the point of being guilty of impaired driving. So in this case, imagine the officer's perspective. A recently graduated kid with no known criminal record is stopped and appears to have had a few drinks. We don't know how many he may or may not have had, and Jeffrey Dahmer was also known later in life for his ability to drink others under the table. I can attest to this, as I have seen some who seem mostly fine, maybe barely over the limit, provide a breath alcohol sample over 4 times the legal limit of 0.08, so high that we have to take them to the hospital because they're in danger of alcohol poisoning. So since we don't know how badly Dahmer appeared to officers to be intoxicated, we can guess that he may or may not have passed these roadside tests. In either case, officers would have had discretion on making an arrest. A DUI arrest is the most technical and convoluted misdemeanor arrest an officer will likely make, and take hours to complete, requiring over a dozen different forms, multiple witnesses, and can be further complicated by breath test machines that are down, preventing officers from even making the arrest in certain towns. Another possible outcome was simply this: the officer could have used their discretion in a misdemeanor crime to not make an arrest, even if they felt there may have been probable cause. So in Florida, officers are not required to make an arrest for certain misdemeanor crimes, aside from domestics. However, in the year of 1978, almost no department required an arrest for a domestic, which is seen and treated as a very serious crime today. So it's entirely possible the officer didn't think he was able to make an arrest based on the evidence, or he didn't have the ability to if the machine was down, or he simply didn't want to, as he either didn't think it was too egregious a case or he didn't feel like making the arrest. Let's assume for a minute Dahmer had been arrested. In the documentary, Dahmer gives an excuse that the bags are lawn trimmings, and that he was moving his lawn and disposing of the clippings. Based on the given timeline, the body would likely not have smelled of decomposition at all yet, and we don't typically start opening sealed bags without a warrant. That's if the officer even bothered to do a proper inventory of the contents of the vehicle prior to towing it, which today is required. It's entirely possible that even if an arrest had been made, the vehicle would have been towed after a very light search, and Dahmer would have been bonded out the following morning and retrieved his vehicle before anyone could have noticed any odd smells. It's simply too hard to say what could have happened, but there is a definite chance, however small, that he could have been caught and stopped then. And if the officer remembers this stop, I'm certain they regret their decision made for any of the above reasons to this day. This would be the last known and admitted murder committed by Dahmer for nearly a decade. Dahmer would go on to enlist in the army and spend several years in Germany. During this time, it was reported that he would rape 2 service members after drugging them. It is important to note that this was his modus operandi, or method of operating, as he would use the same tactic on almost every victim to come. Dahmer would be discharged early, where he would return to Ohio to live with his father for a short time until an eventual arrest for disorderly intoxication in September of 1981. At this time, his father hoped his grandmother, who Dahmer liked, would be a good influence on him, and so sent him back to Milwaukee to live with her. In August of 1982, Dahmer would have yet another run-in with the law, where he exposed himself to people at a state fair. He was given a fine and no jail time, as he was during the first arrest. Again, in August of 1986, Dahmer is arrested for a more serious charge where he was charged with disorderly conduct for masturbating in front of 2 young boys. Again, he was given 1 year probation and counseling. In this time frame, Dahmer will kill 3 more times. These men were Stephen Tomey, James Doxator, and Richard Guerrero. Stephen Tomey was at the 219 Club when he met Dahmer. Dahmer allegedly struck up a conversation with Stephen, and after drinking and talking for several hours, both men returned to the scene of Dahmer's second murder, the Ambassador Hotel. Dahmer, per his own account, had become a serial rapist who regularly lured drunken men back to the Ambassador Hotel so that he could drug them and sexually assault them. He also reportedly liked to listen to their bodies' internal noises while they were passed out. Once at the hotel, Dahmer drugged Stephen, and says he never intended to kill him, but once he awoke, he found that he had beaten Stephen to death. Dahmer then stuffed Stephen into a suitcase and brought him back to his grandmother's home, where Stephen was ultimately dismembered. His body would never be found, and despite Dahmer admitting to the killing, Stephen is still listed as a missing person to this day. James Doxator was a 14-year-old runaway. According to his mother, James ran away due to an abusive stepfather, and by pure awful chance ran right into Dahmer at a bus stop. Dahmer convinced James to come back to his apartment by offering him money, where James would never be seen or heard from again. Richard Guerrero was a 25-year-old man whom Dahmer had offered $50 to spend the night with him at his grandmother's house. Once there, Richard was drugged, raped, strangled, and dismembered. Richard would only be identified when Dahmer was caught by a photograph Dahmer had taken of him. In the documentary, we see Dahmer drug a man at his grandmother's home, and we see her stay up and basically foil Dahmer's attempt to kill him, sparing the young man's life. Sadly, as far as we know, this is yet another invention of the series. This brings us to the final time Dahmer would be arrested before the discovery of his murders, and the final time the justice system could have done something to stop Dahmer's madness. In September of 1988, Dahmer was arrested for drugging and raping a 13-year-old boy, Somsak Synthesomphone. Those of you familiar with this case will recognize the name, and for those of you unfamiliar, we'll delve into the tragedy of a future victim in a short bit. Somsak was drugged and raped by Dahmer, and yet miraculously spared. For the previously mentioned sexual assault of Somsak, Dahmer was charged with second-degree sexual assault, in this case a Class B felony since the victim was under the age of 16 and the offender was at least 3 years older at the time of the attack. Today, this charge carries a sentence of up to 60 years. Incredibly, Dahmer was sentenced to 12 months in jail and 5 years of probation after the fact. Even more incredibly, Dahmer was released early and would stay out of jail until his later final arrest. Something else of note here. Dahmer was actually sentenced during this 12-month period to a work release program, meaning he was only in jail at night and was free on the streets during the day. We will be talking about the many failures that could have prevented Dahmer from killing more if each of these charges had been taken seriously. Not only were there failings by police, but primarily from the courts and lawmakers, which is a theme we still see today. Despite multiple arrests in instances where the police actually did do their job right and built a strong case for the prosecution, such as in the case of Somsak, the courts and prosecution dropped the ball. Often, the prosecution offers a plea deal because they fear going to trial and losing the case, which would count as a strike against their own record. Public defenders also have the same mentality. This frequently results in offenders who are repeatedly committing serious felony offenses getting exceptionally light sentences, as judges rarely ever go against a plea deal. Even in the best of circumstances, when a case is prosecuted fully and a guilty conviction is reached, the judge has discretion in his sentencing guidelines. While I was not able to find out definitively what the charge for a second-degree assault of a child recommends as a sentence at that time, it can be universally agreed that Dahmer's sentence of 10 months in jail is outrageously insufficient and lenient considering the crime. There is much more to be said on this, but the bottom line is Dahmer should have been locked up for many more years, and the Somsaks effectively got zero justice as a victim. To add insult to injury, Somsak's brother, Konarak, would be a future victim of Dahmer and lose his life. We'll get into that shortly, but suffice to say the justice system absolutely failed Somsak and Konarak in a way that has rarely been seen. So from the time of Stephen Hicks in June of 1978, Dahmer murders 3 other men before being arrested for the aforementioned sexual assault of Somsack. Dahmer then serves his 10-month sentence, and the world is safe from him for a short, blissful period. If Dahmer had been properly sentenced, at least according to today's guidelines, it's very likely this would have been the very last victim of Dahmer, at least outside of prison. Keep that light sentence handed down in mind as we continue forward and as the victims and atrocities add up. In March of 1990, the rehabilitated Dahmer is released. The first to fall victim to him after is Anthony Sears, who Dahmer meets at a local gay nightclub, La Cage. Something of note here is that Dahmer and Sears would actually be driven back to Dahmer's apartment by a friend of Sears. This would be another very useful fact had it been reported to police, but it is unknown if it was at this time. What is known is that Sears' mother reports that it was not uncommon for Sears to disappear for days or weeks at a time, and as such, this led to a huge delay in Sears being reported missing. In total, it took 4 weeks for Sears to be officially reported missing. Sears would meet his end the same way so many others had, and Dahmer would keep Sears' skull and genitalia preserved in his apartment as trophies. After this, Dahmer wouldn't kill again for over a year. In 1990, 4 more men would fall victim to Dahmer and his twisted desires: Raymond Smith, Eddie Smith, Ernest Miller, and David Thomas. Little is known about Raymond Smith, other than that he was a sex worker and was lured by Dahmer back to the apartment after being offered money for sex. Raymond would be killed and dismembered, with the skull and other select bones having been recovered after being used as ornaments around the apartment, as described by Dahmer. Raymond is reported to have left behind a 10-year-old daughter. Eddie Smith was next, and would also be lured back to Dahmer's apartment after being seen with Dahmer across multiple clubs around Milwaukee. Eddie would be one of several bodies with no remains left, which Dahmer would later say he regretted, as he claimed to always like to keep something of them around, something of their own bodies. Eddie would leave behind a loving family who would testify to their loss at the trial, and choose to remind the world of who Eddie was during his life, remembering him as he was. Ernest Miller was a young man with aspirations of becoming a dancer, something that many of Dahmer's victims had in common. Most of what we know from all Dahmer's encounters with his victims comes solely from his account, but they seem mostly consistent. Dahmer lured Miller back to his apartment with the promise of money, before making an attempt to drug him. Because Dahmer only had 2 sleeping pills, he ended up killing Miller by severing the artery in his neck with a knife. David C. Thomas was the father of a 2-year-old girl, and happened to meet Dahmer at a mall. Dahmer convinced Thomas to return to his apartment, where he would never be seen again. According to Thomas's family, he had not been seen or heard from in over a month prior to being reported missing, a frustrating pattern we see in many of Dahmer's victims. Thomas would be the last victim of 1990. 1991 would be the worst year yet for Dahmer. It seemed that he really began to spin out of control, and this he would attribute to stress from the loss of his job that would occur later this year. Curtis Strouder, 17. Curtis would meet Dahmer at a bus stop, and would be lured back to his apartment after being offered money to pose for photographs. Curtis would be drugged, restrained, and ultimately dismembered. Errol Lindsay. On April 7, 1991, Dahmer met Errol Lindsay on the road and persuaded him to come back to the apartment. Unlike most of Dahmer's victims, Errol was straight and showed no sexual interest in the serial killer. However, Jeffrey struck up a friendship with him on the spot, charming Errol and invited him up for some beer. Once Errol entered the apartment, Jeffrey proceeded to drug him before carefully using power tools to drill a hole in his head. Next, he took some hydrochloric acid and poured it into the hole, hoping to render the victim in a vegetative state. Eventually, Errol awoke and complained of a headache and asked for some water. Dahmer used this opportunity to drug Errol again and decided to just kill him this time. Errol would have the grim distinction of being the first victim of Dahmer's to suffer the drill. Using this method, Dahmer would take a power drill and drill a hole in the victim's head, pouring hydrochloric acid or water into the victim's brain in hopes of making them a subservient zombie that would never leave him. Dahmer's next victim was Anthony Hughes. Despite what the Dahmer docuseries showed, there was no known relationship between Hughes and Dahmer, neither said by Dahmer or known by friends or family of Hughes. What we do know is Hughes left with Dahmer from a nightclub and told friends to pick him up from his sister's home the following day. Hughes would never make it there, and friends would not be able to identify Dahmer until he was arrested for the murders. Conorak Synthesum Foam. Let's spend some time on this one. Few greater failures by the police have ever happened, and the backstory to this is absolutely tragic. Conorak is the brother of Somsack, who Dahmer went to jail for committing second-degree assault against, as mentioned earlier. The family had already been totally let down by the justice system once, and it was going to happen again. Conorak would be approached by Dahmer at a mall, and offered money to let Dahmer photograph him in the nude. What's incredible is that this was the same thing that happened to Somsack, and Conorak would very likely have known this. Despite this, his family was impoverished and needed the money, and so Conorak agreed to go along. Conorak would be drugged, and per some accounts assaulted inside the apartment before having a small hole drilled in his head. Dahmer would then leave the apartment, and Conorak would manage to escape, albeit in a drugged and disoriented state. 2 women would find him downstairs, and call the police to report a drugged and injured boy. To the woman, Conorak was obviously a child. As to the officers who responded, they did a basically non-existent job of verifying any information at all on scene. To begin with, they responded to the scene of a naked male, bleeding from the head and possibly the anus by some accounts, who was nude and disoriented. While trying to identify Conorak, which they didn't do, Dahmer returns on scene. Dahmer tells the officers that Konorak is his lover, and that he is just really drunk, which explains why he isn't speaking clearly and stumbling and naked. Despite multiple pleas to act from the witnesses, the officers escort Konorak back to Dahmer's apartment. So let's talk about where the officers failed, and what safeguards have been put in place today to ensure nothing like this happens again. So firstly, the officers, by multiple accounts, failed to actually identify Konorak, which likely would have led to a discovery that he was just a 14-year-old. Secondly, no background check was ever run on Dahmer. If one had been, it would have shown that he is on probation for sexual assault of a minor. That little information alone would have been enough to likely save Konorak and lead to an arrest of Dahmer. It's even more possible that after securing a search warrant to the home, all of the evidence of Dahmer's crimes would have been discovered, and several more lives would have been spared. Today, we have many safeguards in place when dealing with domestic disputes, which Dahmer alleged this was. Firstly, both parties would be identified and a records check would be run. Any injuries would be documented, and if someone was so intoxicated they couldn't speak or walk straight, paramedics would be called to check on the person. If they couldn't make the decision to seek or deny treatment, they would have been taken to a hospital where the extent of the injuries would have been seen, as well as the drugs in the system. This is a requirement today, especially after so many domestic cases where law enforcement was unable to or unwilling to act. However, due to fears and uncomfortability with homosexuality and a fear of AIDS, it's likely the cops did not want to get too close to either Dahmer or Konorak. It is disgraceful what happened to this family and the loss they had to suffer due to this. Even going above the cops' negligence, the family believed Dahmer to still be locked up, due to the severity of his crimes against Somsak. But because of this failure of the justice system, Dahmer was let back loose on the world. It seems a cruel twist of fate that would have them suffer an even greater loss at Dahmer's hand again. Dahmer's next victim would be Matt Turner, only a month later. Turner, a 20-year-old runaway from home, would meet Dahmer at a bus stop. Dahmer alleges he was on his way to a gay pride parade when they met, and managed to lure Turner back to his apartment, where Turner met the same fate so many others had before him. Pay attention to these dates now. As you can see, Dahmer murders his final 3 victims in the same month, showing a terrifying acceleration. If he had not been caught when he had, who knows how much longer he would have gone on for. A sobering thought to ponder as we come to the next victim, Jeremiah Weinberger. Jeremiah met Dahmer while in Chicago, and the two took a bus back to Milwaukee for a weekend getaway. While here, Dahmer followed his MO, and after being drugged, he injected boiling water into Jeremiah's brain. This led to Jeremiah falling into a coma. Outside of the norm, it appears that Dahmer waited 2 days and watched Jeremiah before Jeremiah eventually succumbs to his injuries. Just days later, Dahmer would meet Oliver Lacey while out and about. After approaching Lacey, Dahmer told him he was a photographer and asked him to take nude photos, which Lacey agreed to. Dahmer advised they had consensual sex, but afterwards Dahmer would drug Lacey. Dahmer reports that he tried to keep him alive as long as possible, but that he had to go to work, and as such resorted to strangling him and carving out his heart to keep. Joseph Bredehoff was next. A married father of 3, Joseph had recently moved to Milwaukee to pursue a new job. Likely due to money concerns, as with so many of Dahmer's victims, he agreed to pose nude for Dahmer for $50. This tragic mistake would lead to him being drugged and strangled, like so many others, before having his head and torso kept as trophies by Dahmer. In this case, his remains would only be there for a short while, as Dahmer's time was drawing to a close. Enter Tracy Edwards, otherwise known as the one who got away. Edwards met Dahmer at a bar, and after talking for only a bit, followed him back to his apartment. Something to remember here is that Edwards is the only victim able to give us his account. Every other account comes from Dahmer alone. However, the things we hear from Edwards line up greatly with what Dahmer told us. Edwards said that he was handcuffed by Dahmer, but only on one wrist. It was not specified what he was handcuffed to, but it is assumed nothing. Edwards would state that he was forced to lie with Dahmer and watch the movie, while Dahmer would lie on his chest and tell Edwards that he was going to eat his heart. Edwards watched, and when he saw an opportunity, he took it, punching Dahmer in the face and fleeing out of the apartment, before waving down police, who this time would not listen. Police would follow Edwards back to Dahmer's apartment, where Dahmer would allow the police inside. Ultimately, officers would find a drawer full of photographs depicting each of the horrific things that Dahmer had done to his victims, with one officer exclaiming, "My God, these are real." Dahmer was instantly arrested, and the discovery on the House of Horrors would continue, ultimately culminating in the remains of 15 people being found, with Dahmer admitting to killing 17. Interestingly enough, if Dahmer had not answered the door, or gone outside to be arrested, or simply refused to let officers inside, it's likely he would have simply been charged with crimes against Tracy, such as aggravated assault and false imprisonment. These charges likely wouldn't have secured a search warrant for Dahmer's home, and it's scary to think how close, even this time, would have been to Dahmer not being caught. As we saw, there were so many close calls that Dahmer could have been arrested for and stopped sooner. Like the first one, it's reasonable to understand why he wasn't arrested, and yet we see officers in the second instance who have every single reason to believe something is going on, literally give an injured victim back into the hands of this monster. And even when Dahmer was arrested and made to pay for his crimes, he is given a frustratingly weak sentence that just enabled him to kill so many more. What should be mentioned too, not as an excuse but as an eye-opener, were other areas that allowed for Dahmer to go unnoticed for so long. When we look at many of his victims, some were not even reported missing for weeks. This is a tragic reality for many people in America, and only compounds the issue of police investigating missing persons, especially during this time when you have victims that were reported missing out of other jurisdictions, with very limited communication between departments. Dahmer made a habit out of luring victims in who needed money, either due to drug habits or simply wanting to make more money for their families, like Somsak and Konarak. I do want to take a moment here and quote from the original Dahmer case investigator, Ann Schwartz. "When we see documentaries, we tend to take them as total truth, where many aspects have been dramatized in order to push a certain narrative or increase talk or outrage about the show." In 1991, Ann wrote a book titled Monster, the true story of the Jeffrey Dahmer murders. Some of the things shown in the documentary she objects to are Dahmer's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, going to Dahmer's apartment, which Ann reports never happened. Also regarding the smell that outraged so many people and was a source of frustration for others who wondered why police didn't further investigate the smell of decaying humans inside the apartment, especially when police themselves went there in the past. According to Ann, who was there and very familiar with the smell of decomposition, "I was a crime scene reporter for 5 years, so I know what it smells like when you walk into a building with a dead body or a decomposing body. This was not that. This was a very chemical smell. As someone who has smelled literally dozens of decomposing bodies in my career, I can too attest that it is not a smell you ever mistake for anything else, nor one that won't immediately be identifiable and raise red flags. This was seen in the case of John Wayne Gacy, the clown serial killer. When a detective went to his house, he noticed a smell of decomposition and immediately applied for a search warrant, also based on other evidence they had, leading to a discovery of everything we now know of Gacy. This, along with the fabricated relationship with one of his victims in the show, are just examples of how you should do your own research and look into the facts of a case before taking everything as face value." Another thing to note, Dahmer was accused of being a racist by preying mostly on people of color. This is despite Dahmer stating that he did not make his decisions based on race, but numerous other physical factors, as noted in the FBI files. Not a defense of Dahmer in any way, but I would find it strange if the self-admitted murderer, pedophile, rapist, cannibal lied about being a racist. However, many people feel differently about this, which is fine. Ultimately, we would do well to remember and honor the victims and their families, and put into practice the things that were not done before to ensure that we never let something like this happen again. And as an interesting finale to this, I did want to mention this odd bit of knowledge. Dahmer actually was baptized Christian, the same day that John Wayne Gacy was executed. Also on the same day this occurred was a solar eclipse. On the one hand, you have Dahmer, who by all accounts repented and was allegedly remorseful for what he had done. And then you have Gacy, who was stubborn until the very end and whose last words were reportedly, "Kiss my ass." A very odd contrast with two of the most horrific killers in US history. I want to take this time to thank you all for watching my first video on this, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing about this crime from a cop's perspective. We'll be doing many more videos, not just on this topic, but also on major crime cases, to include interviews with death row inmates, coverage on cops that have gone bad, and etc. If you like the work, go ahead and subscribe. If not, then feel free to join back. You're always welcome here. I'll be doing my best to put out videos weekly, as I'm new to editing. If you guys have any comments or questions, or even suggestions, go ahead and let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to interact with each and every one of them. Stay safe.